Well, hello good people, welcome to our presentation video. In this video, we want to talk about Restoration and 18th century Restoration drama. So, after watching our video, we hope that good people know about the history, the characteristic, the popular playwright, and the mark of Restoration and 18th century drama.
The Restoration and 18th century drama historical context. This period lasted from 1660 to around 1688. Written after the restoration of the monarchy in the 1660, following the period of the Commonwealth. The name restorations come from the inauguration of Charles II as the restoration of monarchy in the 1660, as he regained the throne was surely a sight to behold. Samuel Pepys recorded the event in his diary, describing the crowd of 10,000 people who watched the king with his scepter in his hand, under a canopy borne up by 6 silver staves carried by barons of the Cinque-Port and the little bells at every end. This grand celebration signaled the beginning of the new era of England. Literary historians sometimes split the period into three eras. The first, the Age of Dryden from 1660 to 1700. During the Age of Dryden, the Restoration and the years immediately following the Glorious Revolution, literary culture was largely centered on the court. Patronage from aristocratic families remained the primary source of income for writers, and the subjects and attitudes reflected their attachment to the court. This age is particularly known for its witty and ribald drama, plays that display and sometimes satirize the debauched behavior of the upper classes. Reaction against Restoration excess set in the 1690s, and the cynical comedy of manners began to fade. With the turn of the century, Enlightenment thought began to take more prominence, and with it came an increasing optimism about human nature and the potential to reform human shortcomings. And the next one is the Age of Pope and Swift. The Age of Pope and Swift that followed can be seen as marking a shift in the literary culture from the court to the coffee house, as these important social centers began to become a central meeting places for politicians and writers. Many of the great writers of this era were directly engaged with politics, and satire became one of the central features of the age. It was also the age that gave rise to some of the most important journalistic literature in English history, most notably Addison and Steele's Spectator, which helped to establish a certain moral pose as well as the strange style as the model for the century that would follow. These authors were now writing for a broader audience, in part because patronage from the court and the aristocracy began to disappear, and rather increasingly depended on publishers and marketplace for their livelihood. With the middle of century, many of these changes led to the new and varied literary forms, in particular forms such as the novel that focus more squarely on the individual and his or her feelings and experience. And the last one is the Age of Johnson. The second half of the 18th century, sometimes affectionately refers to as the Age of Johnson, a tribute to Samuel Johnson, Britain's most influential man of letters of the day. Johnson, a poet, critic, journalist, essayist, scholar, and lexicographer, was also a talker, a brilliant conversationalist who enjoyed holding a fort at coffee houses, clubs, and parties. He was friends with many of the greatest literary and artistic talents of the time, and stood at the center of a lively circle of intellectuals that included his biographer James Boswell, the historian Edward Gibbon, the novelist and diarist Fanny Burney, and the comic dramatist Richard Brinsley Sheridan. The 18th century concerns with real life can be seen in the number, variety, and quality of non-fiction works published during the Age of Johnson. Works of biography, history, philosophy, politics, economics, literary criticism, aesthetics, and natural history all achieved the level of literature. Writers strove for a style not merely clear and accurate, but also eloquent and persuasive. Edward Gibbon's The History of Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire is a superb example of the height achieved by non-fiction prose during these years. Also notable are the works of philosopher David Hume, the artist Sir Joshua Reynolds, and the economist Adam Smith, and of course Johnson himself, who described his notion for good styles as familiar but not coarse and elegant but not ostentatious. Johnson wrote a dictionary of the English language, a stupendous feat that won him an important place in literary history. His essays remain classic examples of the formal 18th century prose at which he was acknowledged master. He also wrote graceful biographies of poets and critics of poems and other literary works. Johnson was more than an accomplished writer. He was a literary dictator of London and undisputed arbiter of taste for his time. Taft Johnson and most of his associates affirmed neoclassical ideals. During this time, poetry entered a transitional stage in which poets began writing simpler, freer lyrics on subjects close to the human heart. The reflective poetry of Oliver Goldsmith and Thomas Gray and the lyrical song of Scotland's Robert Burns anticipate the first stirring of Romanticism at the very end of the century. At the heart of literature is an attempt to come to terms with the political events that had occurred in previous decades. The writings of this time are both innovative and varied. The style and subject matter of the literature produced during the Restoration period span the spectrum from definitely religious to satirical and risque. In 1688, James II, Charles II's brother, was removed from the throne, with many scholars used to mark the end of Restoration literature. What the mark of the drama period? Use of technology both structurally and visually. Audience sophisticated aristocracy and semi-operas. It turned into semi-operas with singing, dancing and special effects, musical theater, in which the story is told through a combination of spoken dialogue and musical numbers, and also women's role in daily life. But that means women of this period were as interested in new ideas as men were, but they were excluded from the public areas where men enjoyed lively discussions. Undaunted, some women had salons, bringing intellectual wealth into their own homes. Others, through their writing, brought into the public sphere. The aspects on that particular drama period are the costume, the most personal aspect of the visual elements in drama. To members of the audience, a performer and his or her costume are perceived as one. They merge into a single image on stage. The setting, the time and place where a scene occurs, it can help to set the mood, influence the way characters behave, affect the dialogue, foreshadowing events, and also invoke an emotional response. The message, it can making sense to the viewers and they can get the strong message. And finally, the characteristic, it focuses on narrative, serves the presentation of life, focus on events, mise en scene, a protagonist who is easy to relate to, and complex plot.
Alright, let me continue. So, the drama of this period can be broken into two categories, which are comedies and tragedy. The first category is tragedy. Much of the Elizabethan playwriters blended tragedy and comedy, whereas the Restoration dramatists chose to separate the two, which called Nettleton. Restoration tragedy is classified as heroic tragedy. Heroic tragedy is very extraordinary and usually encompasses some extremely good deed done by a very willful, admirable character. Restoration tragedy refers to neoclassical rules, making it very imitative. Usually these tragedies are reworking of Shakespearean plays. The second category is comedy. So there are three types of comedies that were popular during the Restoration. These three types are humor, manners, and intrigue. Comedies of humor were made popular by the Renaissance playwright and poet Ben Jonson earlier in the century. Comedy of manners was the most popular form of Restoration drama. The third and final form of comedy during the Restoration is the comedy of intrigue. Okay, next. Who are playwrights may contribute also to the English literature within the period. These are John Dryden from The Hind and the Panther and Alfred Penn from Orinoco. And then, who are the major playwrights during the period? First is William Congreve Mary Picks, George Farquhar, William Wycherley, and John Frenberg. The next is a summary of The Provoked Wife by John Frenberg. So, The Provoked Wife is a comedy play which was written by John Frenberg in 1697 with the focus less on love scene and more on discussion between female friends Lady Prudence and Belinda and male friends Constant and Humphrey. These discussions are not only full of joke but are also thoughtful and often has back of melancholy and frustration.
What are the major works during the period? In the Restoration period, dramatists are allowed to divorce all prior restraints to their works and create production that would allow for the emergence of newer and livelier theatrical trends. Another common trend in theater during the Restoration period was the reinterpretation of older plays. These were often turned into semi-operas with singing, dancing, and special effects. Performances such as Hamlet, Macbeth, and The Tempest were heavily revised and altered to appeal to the larger audience. Women as well began to make an appearance in theater with the advent of the Restoration as new trend. This addition allowed for sexually suggestive scenarios on the stage to become even more open and raunchy, a quality that greatly suited the public taste during this time. Okay, good people, that's all about the Restoration and 18th century Restoration drama. We hope you'll get some important things from our video. Alright, thank you for all your time and your attention watching our video. Have a great day everyone.